In the unforgiving frontier town of Cedar Ridge, bearing a daughter instead of a son could mean death. When Martha collapsed outside the general store, clutching her newborn girl, the townspeople turned their backs. Her husband had already abandoned them both, declaring no man should waste his name on worthless females. Left bleeding in the dirt with winter approaching, Martha prepared to die alongside her baby. But fate had other plans. Jake Coleman, a quiet cowboy barely scraping by on his failing ranch, found them as the sun set behind the mountains. Without hesitation, he scooped them both into his arms and carried them home. What he didn't know was that this simple act of kindness would change all their lives forever. But can one man's compassion overcome a town's cruelty, and will Martha ever believe she deserves the love he's offering? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried the scent of pine and approaching snow across the valley as Jake Coleman guided his weathered wagon along the rutted path toward his cabin. The woman in his arms hadn't stirred since he'd lifted her from the dirt outside Miller's general store, and the tiny bundle she clutched, a baby girl wrapped in a blood-stained shawl, remained eerily quiet. Jake's calloused hands gripped the reins tighter as he remembered the disgust in the townspeople's faces, the way they'd stepped back as if Martha Hartley carried some contagious shame. The cabin that greeted them sat modest and lonesome against the backdrop of towering pines, its weathered logs chinked with mud and moss. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. Jake hadn't bothered lighting a fire in days, seeing little point in warming a home meant for one. But tonight, everything would be different. Inside, dust motes danced in the fading light that filtered through windows that hadn't seen a woman's touch in the 32 years Jake had walked this earth. His mother had died birthing him, and his father, well, Thomas Coleman, had made his choice when Jake turned 12 and the ranch started failing. One morning, Jake woke to find nothing but empty drawers and a note that said some men weren't meant for staying. Jake laid Martha on his own bed, the only one in the single-room cabin, then carefully placed the baby in a wooden crate he hastily lined with his cleanest shirt. The woman's face, pale as winter moonlight, carried the gaunt hollows of hunger and the grey pallor of blood loss. Her dark hair, matted with sweat and dirt, framed features that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. She couldn't be more than 25, he reckoned, though hardship had a way of aging a person beyond their years. The baby stirred, letting out a weak cry that tugged at something deep in Jake's chest. He'd helped birth enough calves to know the signs of a difficult delivery, and Martha's torn skirt told a story of suffering he didn't care to imagine. Setting water to boil on his wood stove, Jake tried to remember what his neighbor's wife had done when her sister took childbed fever years ago. As he worked, cleaning wounds, spooning broth between Martha's lips, checking the baby's breathing, Jake's mind wandered to the small tin box he kept beneath loose floorboards by his bed. Inside lay his father's wedding ring, a simple gold band he'd never had the courage to wear or the heart to sell. For 20 years, that ring had represented everything Jake feared about love and commitment. The possibility of running when times got hard, of abandoning those who counted on you most. 3 days passed in a blur of fevered nursing. Martha drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling out names Jake didn't recognize, other times weeping for the baby she was certain had died. Each time, Jake would bring the child close enough for Martha to hear her breathing, to feel the warmth of tiny fingers grasping blindly in the air. Dr. Marcus Henderson arrived on the third evening, his black bag worn smooth from decades of house. Calls across the territory. A man in his 60s with silver whiskers and kind eyes, Doc Henderson had delivered half the babies in Cedar Ridge and buried nearly as many of their grandparents. He examined Martha with professional detachment while Jake hovered nearby, wringing his hat in weathered hands. "She'll live," Doc announced, washing his hands in Jake's wash basin. "Though it was touch and go there for a spell, that baby's healthy too, considering. Strong lungs on her." He dried his hands slowly, studying Jake with the careful assessment of a man who'd seen too much human nature. Course, you know what? Folks in town are saying. Jake's jaw tightened. I reckon I can imagine. Sheriff Garrett's been asking questions. Nothing official, mind you, but he's concerned about appearances. Says it doesn't look proper, you harboring another man's wife. Thomas Hartley left her to die in the street, Jake said quietly. What kind of man does that make him? The kind that's got legal claim to both woman and child, unfortunately. Doc Henderson closed his bag with a decisive snap. I'm not saying it's right, Jake. I'm saying it's the law. You'd do well to remember that. After Doc Henderson left, Jake sat by Martha's bedside watching her sleep. The baby, whom he'd taken to calling Little Bit in the absence of a proper name, dozed fitfully in her makeshift cradle. Firelight played across Martha's face, and for the first time in days, color had returned to her cheeks. The general store owner, Sarah Mills, had been the only townsperson to show any kindness during Martha's collapse. A widow herself, at 43, Sarah understood the precarious position of women without male protection. She'd slipped Jake a bundle of baby clothes and a jar of goat's milk when he'd come to town for supplies, pressing the items into his hands. With tears in her eyes, "That poor girl," Sarah had whispered, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Thomas Hartley's always been a cold fish, but to abandon his own wife and child. There's no excuse for such cruelty." Sheriff William Garrett represented the law in Cedar Ridge, though his interpretation of justice often bent to accommodate the town's influential men. A tall, lean man with a grey mustache and calculating eyes, Garrett had built his reputation on keeping the peace through selective enforcement. He'd made his position clear during his visit to Jake's ranch the previous afternoon. "Now, I'm not saying you did wrong helping the woman," Garrett had said, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Christian charity and all that. But housing, another man's wife, well, that's a different matter entirely. Creates all sorts of uncomfortable situations." Jake had stood his ground on his own porch, meeting Garrett's gaze steadily. "She was dying, Sheriff, the baby too, and that's commendable, son. But she's recovered now, hasn't she? Time to think about what's proper." Garrett's smile never reached his eyes. "Thomas Hartley's got rights, legal rights. Best not to forget that." The truth was, Jake's own situation remained precarious. His small ranch, inherited from his mother's side of the family, barely generated enough income to keep him fed through. Winter, cattle prices had dropped, and disease had claimed 6 of his breeding stock the previous spring. The bank in town held notes on most of his equipment, and he was already 2 months behind on payments. Yet as he sat watching Martha sleep, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. This woman and her child needed protection, and he was perhaps the only man in Cedar Ridge willing to provide it. The irony wasn't lost on him, the town's most marginal citizen becoming guardian to its most vulnerable outcasts. Martha's eyes fluttered open as the fire began to die down. For a moment, confusion clouded her gaze as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Then memory returned, and with it, a look of panic. "My baby," she whispered, trying to sit up despite her weakness. "She's right here," Jake said softly, lifting the child from her makeshift cradle. "Sleeping peaceful as you please." Martha's hands trembled as she reached for her daughter, tears streaming down her face as she cradled the tiny form. "I thought, when I couldn't hear her crying, I was certain she'd died." "She's a fighter," Jake said, "like her mama." For the first time since he'd found them, Martha truly looked at Jake, taking in his weathered face, his gentle brown eyes, the careful way he moved around her and the baby. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why did you help us?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying embers of the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years spent alone. "My daddy left when I was 12. Just packed up one night and rode out, leaving me to figure things out on my own. I swore then I'd never be the kind of man who turns his back when someone needs help." Martha nodded slowly, understanding passing between them in the flickering firelight. Outside, wind howled around the cabin's corners, and the first snow of winter began to fall. Inside, three souls who'd known abandonment and loss found themselves bound together by circumstance and the radical notion that every life, even that of an unwanted baby girl, possessed immeasurable worth. The blood-stained shawl lay folded on Jake's dresser, cleaned as best he could manage, but forever marked by the violence of Martha's abandonment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, fresh threats from those who saw their arrangement as scandalous or improper. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jake Coleman's cabin felt like a home. Martha woke on the fourth morning to sunlight streaming through windows she didn't recognize and the sound of an axe splitting wood outside. For a moment, the peaceful domesticity felt like a dream until she tried to sit up and pain shot through her body, reminding her of everything that had transpired. Beside her makeshift bed, the baby slept in what appeared to be a wooden crate, lined with soft fabric. The cabin smelled of coffee and something she couldn't immediately place. Safety, perhaps, or simply the absence of fear. Through the window, she could see a tall figure in worn denim splitting logs with methodical precision. Jake Coleman moved with the economy of motion that came from years of hard labor, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. A folded paper on the bedside table caught her attention. Her name was written across it in Thomas's familiar, harsh script. With trembling fingers, Martha unfolded what would prove to be the most devastating and liberating document of her life. Martha, the letter began without preamble or affection. By the time you read this, I will be well on my way to Denver. I have taken what belongs to me from our account, and left you what a woman who has failed in her primary duty deserves, nothing. I married you, expecting sons to carry on the Hartley name. Instead, you have given me a useless female who will contribute nothing to my legacy. I will not waste my resources feeding another man's future burden. Find yourself a new protector, as I am finished with the both of you. Do not attempt to follow me or make any claim on my name. As far as the law is concerned, you died in childbirth, along with your worthless spawn. I have already registered the deaths with the territorial authority. Thomas Hartley. Martha read the letter 3 times before its full meaning penetrated her shock. Thomas hadn't simply abandoned them. He had legally erased them. In the eyes of the law, she and her daughter no longer existed. The cruelty was breathtaking in its thoroughness. The baby stirred, and Martha instinctively reached for her, needing the comfort of warm life against her chest. As she lifted her daughter, the letter slipped to the floor with a whisper that seemed to echo through the cabin like a gunshot. Jake appeared in the doorway moments later, his arms full of split wood. The expression on Martha's face stopped him cold. "What is it?" Without a word, Martha handed him the letter. She watched his face. As he read, saw his jaw tighten and his hands clench until the paper crumpled between his fingers. When he finished, the silence stretched between them like a chasm. "That son of a—" Jake caught himself, glancing at the baby. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't speak such words in front of you and the little one. He's legally declared us dead," Martha said, her voice hollow. "We don't exist." Jake set down his load of wood and pulled up a chair beside her bed. "You exist to me. This little girl exists to me. That's what matters." "You don't understand," Martha said, tears flowing freely now. "Without legal standing, I have no rights to anything, no claim to property, no protection under the law. If Thomas changes his mind and decides he wants the baby back, he could simply take her. And you, helping us puts you at risk too. They could charge you with theft, harboring stolen property." "Let them try," Jake said quietly. But Martha heard the steel beneath his calm tone. "I should go," Martha said, struggling to sit up despite her weakness. "I won't bring trouble on you. You've done enough, more than anyone had a right to expect." Jake's hand on her shoulder was gentle but firm. "Where would you go? How would you feed her? It's October, Martha. Winter's coming, and you're in no condition to travel. I'll find a way, I always have, like you found a way when Thomas left you bleeding in the street." The words hit like a physical blow, and Martha flinched. Jake immediately looked stricken. "I'm sorry. That was cruel and uncalled for." "But true," Martha whispered. "I have nothing to offer anyone. I'm not even legally alive anymore." Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "Can you read and write?" The question seemed to come from nowhere. "Yes, of course. My father believed education was important, even for daughters. Figures, arithmetic too. I helped keep my father's books for his store back in Kansas." "Good. Then you've got more to offer than half the men in this territory." Jake stood and walked to the window, looking out at his modest spread. "My cattle have been sickening, and I've lost more than I can afford. The bank's breathing down my neck, and I can barely keep myself fed, let alone hire help. But you might could earn your keep if you've a mind to stay." Martha stared at him. "You're offering me work?" "I'm offering you a chance to prove Thomas Hartley wrong about your worth." Before Martha could respond, the baby began to fuss. As she lifted her daughter to nurse, Martha noticed how the child's tiny fist closed around her finger with surprising strength. Such a small thing to have caused such upheaval, yet Martha couldn't imagine loving anything more fiercely. "She needs a name," Jake said softly. Martha had been thinking about this for days. "Hope," she said finally. "Her name is Hope. Hope." "Coleman sounds fine to me." Martha looked up sharply. "I couldn't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm telling you how things are going to be." Jake's voice carried quiet authority. "In the eyes of the law, you might not exist, but in this cabin, on this land, you're under my protection. Both of you. That makes you family, and family takes the family name." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Martha could only stare at him. Growing up, she'd heard stories of frontier marriages of convenience, arrangements born of necessity rather than affection. But Jake was asking for nothing in return, except her willingness to stay. "I don't understand why you'd do this for strangers," she said. Jake returned to his chair, his weathered hands clasped between his knees. "My mama died bringing me into this world. My daddy couldn't look at me without seeing what he'd lost, so he ran. I grew up knowing I was unwanted, knowing my very existence had cost the life of the only person who might have loved me." He looked at baby Hope, sleeping peacefully in Martha's arms. No child should grow up feeling that way. No woman should die because bearing a daughter is considered a failure. Martha felt something shift inside her chest, a tiny crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. This man, this stranger who'd saved them from certain death, understood loss in a way that resonated with her own pain. "The whole town will think I'm your mistress," she said quietly. "Let them think what they want. We'll know the truth." "And what is the truth?" Jake met her gaze steadily. "The truth is that you and Hope are safe here for as long as you want to stay. The truth is that I could use help with the ranch, and you need a place to call home. Everything else we'll figure out as we go." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the yard. Winter was indeed coming, and with it, the long months when survival would depend on preparation and determination. Martha looked around the modest cabin, at the clean but worn furniture, the carefully banked fire, the shelves lined with practical necessities rather than luxuries. It wasn't much, but it was more than Thomas had left them with. More importantly, it was offered with genuine kindness rather than grudging obligation. "All right," Martha said finally. "We'll stay, but only if you let me earn my keep properly. I won't be anyone's charity case ever again." Jake's smile transformed his weathered face. "Mom, something tells me having you and little Hope around is going to be anything but charity." As if in agreement, Hope chose that moment to open her eyes and gaze up at them both with the solemn curiosity of the very young. Martha saw her own features reflected in the baby's face, but also something new, a strength that hadn't been there before. Perhaps it was wishful thinking, but she could swear her daughter looked less fragile than she had even a day ago. The letter that had shattered one life lay forgotten on the floor, while above it, 3 people who'd found each other in their darkest hour began to imagine what tomorrow might bring. The first 2 weeks of October brought an unexpected rhythm to Jake's cabin. Martha moved carefully at first, her body still healing from the trauma of birth and abandonment, but her spirit seemed to strengthen with each passing day. She insisted on helping despite Jake's protests, starting with small tasks that gradually expanded as her confidence returned. It was while organizing Jake's modest belongings that Martha discovered the bundle hidden beneath her few possessions. Her wedding dress, carefully wrapped in brown paper, the sight of it nearly brought her to her knees. She sank onto Jake's single chair, holding the ivory silk that had once represented all her dreams of love and family. The dress told its own story of betrayal. Wine stains marked the bodice where Thomas had thrown his glass during their wedding. Celebration after learning she was already carrying what he hoped would be a son. Mud caked the hem from her desperate flight through the rain when he'd locked her out of their house during her final month of pregnancy. Worst of all, blood had soaked through the delicate fabric during Hope's difficult birth. Thomas had refused to summon help until it was nearly too late. Martha's hands shook as she examined each mark of cruelty. This dress represented the naive girl who'd believed Thomas Hartley when he promised to cherish and protect her. Looking at it now, she felt only shame for her younger self's foolishness. Jake found her there an hour later, the dress spread across her lap like evidence of a crime. Without a word, she rose and walked toward the fireplace, intent on feeding the ruined silk to the flames. "Wait," Jake said quietly. Martha paused, her hand already reaching toward the fire. "It's ruined. There's no saving it. Some things deserve a second chance," Jake said, moving closer. "Maybe the dress isn't what matters. Maybe what matters is the woman wearing it." His words stopped her cold. She looked down at the stained fabric, then back at his earnest face. "You don't understand. This dress represents everything wrong with my judgment. I was such a fool to believe—" "You were hopeful," Jake interrupted. "Nothing foolish about hope. The fool was the man who didn't treasure what he had." Martha felt tears threatening again, but they were different now. Not tears of despair, but of something she was afraid to name. Carefully, she folded the dress and set it aside. "I don't know why you're so kind to us. Maybe because kindness is what folks do when they care about each other." Before Martha could respond to that startling statement, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. Through the window, they could see Sheriff Garrett approaching, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. Jake stepped protectively closer to Martha, his body language shifting subtly but unmistakably. Garrett dismounted with deliberate slowness, his eyes taking in every detail of the domestic scene visible through the windows. Jake met him on the porch, closing the door firmly behind him. "Afternoon, Jake," Garrett said, his tone deceptively casual. "Thought I'd ride out and see how you're managing with your situation." "Managing fine, Sheriff. Martha's been a great help around the place." "I'm sure she has." Garrett's smile was thin. "Thing is, folks in town are starting to talk. You understand how it is. Unmarried man, another man's wife. People get ideas." "Let them talk," Jake said evenly. "Long as they keep their distance." "I don't see how it's anyone's business but ours." "Well now, that's where you're wrong." Garrett shifted his weight, hand resting casually near his weapon. "Thomas Hartley's got legal rights, and harboring his wife could be seen as theft of property. His wife, his child, law's pretty clear on that." "Thomas Hartley abandoned them to die," Jake said, his voice hardening. "Any rights he had died with." "His signature on that letter." Garrett's eyebrows rose. "What letter?" Jake realized his mistake too late. If Thomas had legally declared Martha and Hope dead, then officially no abandonment had occurred. The letter was evidence of a crime that didn't legally exist. "Just being neighborly, Sheriff," Jake said carefully. "Christian charity and all." "Course you are." Garrett's smile became genuine, and somehow that was worse than his earlier hostility. "Just remember, Jake, charity's got its limits. Push too far, and even Christian kindness can start looking like something else entirely. After Garrett left, Jake found Martha standing by the window, Hope cradled in her arms. She'd heard enough of the conversation to understand the implications. "I'm putting you in danger," she said without turning around. "We're putting each other in danger," Jake corrected. "Difference is, we're doing it by choice." That evening, as Martha prepared their simple supper of beans and cornbread, she found herself studying Jake's movements around the cabin. He was unfailingly courteous, always asking permission before entering a room where she might be nursing. Hope, always ensuring she had the comfortable chair by the fire, always serving her first at meals, despite her protests. It was such a stark contrast to Thomas's behavior that it left her constantly off balance. Thomas had viewed her as property to be managed. Jake treated her as a person worthy of respect. The difference was both healing and terrifying. Healing because it proved she wasn't inherently worthless. Terrifying because it made her want things she'd sworn never to risk again. "Jake," she said as they sat by the fire after supper, Hope sleeping peacefully between them, "tell me about your cattle." He looked surprised by the question. "What about them? You said they've been sickening. What are the symptoms?" For the next hour, Jake described the mysterious illness that had been killing his livestock. Martha listened carefully, asking detailed questions about timing, symptoms, and the animal's living conditions. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "My father's store served several ranches back in Kansas," she said finally. "I remember a similar outbreak one summer. The problem wasn't disease, it was the water source. A dead animal upstream had contaminated the whole creek." Jake sat forward. "You think something's poisoning my water? It's possible. Tomorrow, if you're willing, I'd like to examine your creek and maybe look at the sick animals myself." "You know about animal husbandry?" Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Thomas thought women's opinions were worthless, so I never mentioned it. But my father taught me everything he knew about livestock. Said knowledge was knowledge, regardless of who possessed it." Jake's expression was unreadable in the firelight. "Well," he said finally, "looks like Thomas was wrong about more than one thing." The next morning, Martha bundled Hope carefully and accompanied Jake on his rounds. Her assessment proved correct. A beaver dam upstream had created a stagnant pool where 2 deer carcasses had contaminated the water supply. More importantly, her suggestions for treating the sick animals with herbs and clean water showed immediate results. As they worked side by side that day, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in years: competence. Her knowledge mattered. Here, her opinions were valued. For the first time since Hope's birth, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had something worthwhile to contribute to the world. That night, as she carefully mended one of Jake's torn shirts by lamplight, Martha caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. When their eyes met, he didn't look away. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what? For staying, for helping, for proving that some chances are worth taking." Martha's needle paused in its work. Outside, wind whispered through the pines, and inside, the fire crackled peacefully in the hearth. Hope slept soundly in her makeshift cradle, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Martha felt something that might have been contentment. Martha discovered the recipe book by accident, while searching for clean rags to line Hope's cradle. Hidden beneath a stack of farming almanacs, the leather-bound volume bore the careful handwriting of a woman who had clearly taken pride in her cooking. The pages, yellowed with age, contained not just recipes but personal notes. Jake's favorite: "Add extra molasses," or "Good for when the pastor visits." She opened it carefully, recognizing immediately that this had belonged to a mother. Jake's mother, most likely. The recipes were practical frontier fare, but each one showed evidence of love in its preparation. Annotations in the margins revealed attempts to make simple ingredients into something special, to create comfort and nourishment from whatever the harsh land provided. That evening, Martha approached Jake hesitantly. "I found this while cleaning," she said, holding up the cookbook. I hope you don't mind. Jake's face went through several emotions before settling on something like melancholy. Haven't seen that in years. Ma wrote in that thing right up until... He trailed off, but Martha understood. She must have been a wonderful cook. These recipes are incredibly detailed. Wouldn't know, Jake said quietly. Never had the chance to taste her cooking. Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring ranch did her best to feed me growing up, but it wasn't the same. Martha felt her heart clench at the loneliness in his voice. Here was a man who'd never known a mother's love, never experienced the simple comfort of a home-cooked meal made with care. Without thinking, she made a decision that would change everything between them. Wadoom. You mind if I tried some of these? She asked. I mean, properly tried them, not just the beans and cornbread we've been making do with. Jake looked surprised. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. Martha ran her fingers over the worn pages. These recipes represent something beautiful, Jake. It seems wrong to let them go unused. The next morning, Martha sent Jake to town for supplies while she studied the cookbook in earnest. Hope lay on a quilt nearby, batting at shadows while her mother planned their first real meal together. Martha chose carefully a recipe for pot roast with vegetables that promised to fill the cabin with the kind of aromas that made a place feel like home. When Jake returned that afternoon, he stopped dead in the doorway. The cabin smelled like heaven, rich with the scents of slow-cooked meat and fresh bread. Martha stood at the stove, her hair pinned back and flour dusting her sleeves, looking more at peace than he'd ever seen her. "How did you—" he began, then noticed the cookbook open on the table. "Ma's pot roast. I hope I did it justice. Dinner should be ready soon." That evening, as they sat down to a meal that transformed Jake's simple cabin into something approaching a real home, Martha watched Jake take his first bite. His eyes closed, and for a moment she worried she'd somehow failed to follow the recipe correctly. "It's perfect," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "It tastes like what I always imagined home should taste like." They talked, more that night than they ever had before. Jake shared stories of his childhood, the loneliness, the struggle to keep the ranch running as a boy, his desperate attempts to live up to a father who'd never bothered to know him. Martha found herself reciprocating, telling him about her own father's kindness, her mother's early death, and the gradual realization that Thomas Hartley was nothing like the man he'd pretended to be during their courtship. He was charming at first, Martha admitted, bouncing Hope gently as the baby fussed. "Brought me flowers, quoted poetry, promised me the world. I thought I was so lucky to catch the attention of such an important man." "When did it change?" Jake asked gently. "Almost immediately after the wedding. It was as if he'd been wearing a mask, and once the ceremony was over, he didn't need to pretend anymore." Martha's voice grew quiet. "He wanted a son so desperately. When the midwife told him I was carrying a girl, he said things I'll never forget." Jake's hands clenched into fists on the table. "What kind of things?" "That I'd failed him. That bearing daughters was a woman's greatest shame. That if I couldn't give him sons, I was useless to him." Martha looked down at Hope, who had calmed and was now gazing up at her with trusting eyes. "When she was born, he took one look at her and walked out of the room. The next morning, I woke up to find that letter." "Martha," Jake said softly, and something in his tone made her look up. "You know that's not true, don't you? About daughters being shameful?" "In my head, yes. In my heart." She shrugged helplessly. "It's hard to unlearn a lifetime of being told you're worth less than half the human race. Well, for what it's worth, I think Hope's about the most perfect thing I've ever seen. And her mama's pretty remarkable too." The compliment caught Martha off guard, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Jake, A sudden cry from Hope interrupted whatever she'd been about to say. As Martha lifted the baby to nurse her, she was acutely aware of Jake's presence in the small cabin, of the domestic intimacy they'd somehow created together. It felt dangerous and wonderful at the same time. Over the following days, Martha continued cooking from the recipe book, and each meal seemed to weave them closer together. Jake began lingering over coffee in the mornings, sharing his plans for the ranch and asking for her opinions. Martha found herself looking forward to his return each evening, to the moment when he'd sample whatever she'd prepared and his face would light up with appreciation. But it was more than the food that was changing things between them. It was the way Jake always made sure Martha had the comfortable chair by the fire, the way he'd carved a proper spoon for Hope when he noticed Martha struggling to feed her with the oversized utensils, the way he never failed to ask about Martha's day, as if her thoughts and experiences mattered to him. One evening, as Martha served an apple cobbler she'd found in the back of the cookbook, Jake reached across the table and briefly covered her, hand with his. The touch was innocent, lasting only a moment, but it sent warmth shooting up Martha's arm and straight to her heart. "Thank you," he said simply, "for the cobbler, for making this place feel like a home." Martha looked around the cabin, at the clean surfaces, the warm light, the recipe book lying open on the table, Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle. For the first time in her adult life, she understood what home really meant. It wasn't a building or a place on a map. It was this feeling of safety, of being valued, of belonging somewhere. "Thank you for giving us one," she replied. Their eyes met across the table, and Martha felt something shift between them, something that went far beyond gratitude or convenience. It was then that the sound of approaching horses shattered the peaceful evening, and through the window they could see torches moving toward the cabin like angry stars in the darkness. The torches belonged to a delegation from town, led by Preacher Morrison, a stern man whose interpretation of Christian charity seemed to exclude unwed mothers and the men who sheltered them. Behind him rode three of Cedar Ridge's most prominent citizens: banker Harold Fleming, store owner Samuel Miller, and Thomas Hartley's former business partner, Robert Walsh. Jake stepped onto his porch, his rifle held casually but visibly in his hands. "Evening, gentlemen. Kinda late for social." "A calls, isn't it?" Preacher Morrison urged his horse forward, his gaunt face severe in the torchlight. "Jacob Coleman, we've come to discuss the situation you've created here." "What situation would that be?" "Don't play dumb, son," Banker Fleming interjected. "The whole town knows you're harboring Thomas Hartley's wife and child. It's causing scandal and setting a poor example for our young people." Through the cabin window, Martha watched with growing dread. Hope clutched protectively to her chest. She could see the judgment in these men's faces, the same disgust she'd encountered outside Miller's store weeks ago. "Martha and her baby needed help," Jake said evenly. "I gave it to them. Don't see how that's anyone's business but ours." "It becomes our business when it threatens the moral fabric of our community," Preacher Morrison declared. "A woman living in sin, unmarried, with a man not her husband, it's an abomination before God." "The only sin I see," Jake replied, his voice hardening, "is how this community treated a woman and baby who were dying in the street." Robert Walsh spurred his horse closer, his face ugly with anger. "Thomas Hartley was my partner for 5 years. Good God-fearing man who worked hard to build something in this territory. You got no right to steal what belongs to him." "He threw them away like garbage," Jake said flatly. "A man who abandons his wife and child has no claim to either." "That's not how the law sees it," Fleming said with satisfaction. "Woman belongs to her husband, child too. You're harboring stolen property, Coleman." Inside the cabin, Martha felt the familiar shame rising in her throat. These men spoke of her as if she were livestock, something to be owned and traded, rather than a human being with thoughts and feelings of her own. But then she looked down at Hope, sleeping peacefully despite the raised voices outside, and something fierce and protective flared in her chest. She had spent too many years accepting other people's judgments of her worth. Not anymore. Setting Hope carefully in her cradle, Martha wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch beside Jake. The men's faces registered shock. Proper women didn't interrupt men's business, especially women in her compromised position. "If you're going to discuss me," Martha said, her voice carrying clearly in the night air, "then I'll speak for myself." Martha, you don't have to, Jake started, but she held up a hand. Yes, I do. She faced the mounted men, her chin raised despite the tremor in her voice. You want to know about Thomas Hartley, about what kind of God-fearing man he was. Let me tell you. Preacher Morrison's face flushed. Young woman, you will not speak against your husband in public. He's not my husband, Martha said firmly. A husband protects his wife. A husband doesn't abandon her to die in the street because she bore a daughter instead of a son. A husband doesn't declare his own wife and child legally dead to avoid responsibility for them. The last statement caused a stir among the delegation. Fleming leaned forward in his saddle. What do you mean, legally dead? Martha retrieved Thomas's letter from inside the cabin and held it up for all to see. Thomas registered our deaths with the territorial authority rather than support a daughter. According to the law, Hope and I don't exist. The men exchanged uncertain glances. If Martha and the child were legally dead, then technically no crime was being committed by harboring them. Walsh grabbed for the letter, but Martha pulled it back. You can read it, she said, but you can't take it. It's the only proof I have of what really happened. As Walsh read the letter by torchlight, his face grew increasingly pale. When he finished, he passed it to Fleming, who shared it with the others. The righteous anger that had brought them here began to deflate as they realized the complexity of the situation. This changes things, Fleming admitted reluctantly. If you're legally dead, then Thomas has no claim on you. It also means she has no legal protection, Preacher Morrison pointed out. No rights, no standing before the law. She's completely vulnerable. Which is exactly why she needs someone to protect her, Jake said quietly. And that someone is me. The delegation's mission had clearly failed, but Preacher Morrison wasn't ready to concede defeat. Living in sin is still living in sin, regardless of legal technicalities. If you insist on harboring this woman, at least do right by her and marry her properly. That's between Martha and me, Jake replied. Is it? Morrison's eyes glittered with fanatic fervor. Or is it between all of us and our obligation to uphold Christian values? Before anyone could respond, the sound of galloping hoofbeats interrupted the tense standoff. A single rider approached at breakneck speed, his horse lathered with sweat. As he drew closer, Martha's blood turned to ice. Thomas Hartley had returned to Cedar Ridge. He looked older than when she'd last seen him, his face harder and more calculating. His expensive clothes marked him as a man who'd prospered since abandoning his family, and the gun on his hip suggested he hadn't come back for a friendly reunion. Well, well, Thomas said, dismounting with theatrical flourish. Looks like I arrived just in time for the entertainment. Martha instinctively stepped closer to Jake, who moved protectively in front of her. Hope, disturbed by the commotion, began to cry from inside the cabin. Thomas, Fleming said uncertainly. We thought. You'd gone to Denver. I did. Made quite a fortune there, actually. Thomas's smile was cold as winter wind. But then I heard the most interesting rumors about my dear departed wife and child. Imagine my surprise to learn they'd risen from the dead. You declared them dead, Jake said flatly. We've seen the letter. Thomas laughed, the sound devoid of any warmth. A temporary measure to avoid inconvenience, but I've reconsidered. A man needs heirs, even female ones. And a wife, well, a wife has her uses. He looked Martha up and down with the calculating gaze of a man appraising livestock. You're looking well, my dear. Country life seems to agree with you. Martha found her voice at last. I won't go with you. Oh, but you will, Thomas said pleasantly. You see, I've done my research. Legally, you never stopped being my wife. Our marriage remains valid, and that child is still mine. The death certificates were merely administrative errors that I'm now correcting. Behind him, Martha could see Jake carving something in the shadows, while everyone's attention was focused on Thomas. As he stepped back into the light, she glimpsed what he'd been working on. A small wooden rattle, intricately carved with tiny flowers around its handle. The rattle was meant for hope, Martha realized. A toy made with love and patience during quiet evening hours while she cooked dinner and told stories of her day. In that moment, she understood something that changed everything. Jake wasn't just protecting them out of duty or kindness. He loved them, really, truly loved them both, and she would not let Thomas Hartley destroy that love. The way he'd destroyed everything else good in her life. The confrontation might have turned violent that night if Doc Henderson hadn't arrived unexpectedly, his medical bag in hand and concern etched on his weathered face. His presence seemed to diffuse some of the tension, reminding everyone that they were neighbors who would have to live together long after this dispute was settled. "Heard there was trouble brewing," Doc said, his keen eyes taking in the scene. The torches, the mounted delegation, Thomas's aggressive stance, and Martha pressed close to Jake's protective form. "Thought someone might need medical attention." "Just a family reunion, Doc," Thomas said with false joviality. "Come to collect my wife and child." "That's so." Doc Henderson's voice was carefully neutral, but Martha caught the skeptical look he gave Thomas. "Funny thing about families, usually they don't abandon each other to die in the street." The dig hit its mark. Thomas's smile faltered slightly. "Temporary misunderstanding. Business matters required my immediate attention in Denver. But I'm back now, ready to resume my responsibilities." Over the next hour, as the delegation eventually dispersed with muttered warnings and veiled threats, Martha learned that Thomas's return was far from spontaneous. He'd received word of her survival through business contacts and had spent weeks planning his next move. "I've consulted with lawyers in Denver," Thomas explained to the remaining men, as if Martha weren't standing right there. "My wife's legal status is clear. She belongs to me, along with any children she's born. This man," he gestured dismissively at Jake, "has been unlawfully harboring my property." "She's not property," Jake said quietly, but with unmistakable steel in his voice. "Oh, but she is," Thomas replied pleasantly. "The law is quite specific. On this matter, a wife's duty is to obey her husband, and a husband's right to his wife and children is absolute. Any man who interferes with that relationship can be charged with theft." Martha felt the familiar weight of helplessness settling over her, like a suffocating blanket. Throughout her marriage to Thomas, she'd been reminded constantly of her legal status as property rather than person. Women couldn't own land, couldn't enter contracts, couldn't even claim custody of their own children if their husbands objected. But then she felt Jake's hand briefly touch her shoulder, a gesture of support that reminded her she wasn't alone anymore. When she looked up at him, she saw not pity or resignation, but determination. "We'll see about that," Jake said simply. The next morning, after Thomas had departed to allow her time to prepare for departure, Jake announced he was riding to town. "Need to speak with someone about legal matters." "Jake, you can't fight this," Martha said, bouncing Hope gently as the baby fussed. "Thomas is right about the law. I have no rights." "Maybe not as Martha Hartley," Jake said carefully. "But there might be other options." He returned that afternoon with news that both terrified and thrilled her. Spoke with Judge Crawford. "He says if you were to marry someone else, Thomas's claim would be complicated." Martha stared at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Jake took a deep breath, "that if you'll have me, I'd like to marry you. Properly, legally, with papers and witnesses and everything official." The proposal was so unexpected, so generous, that Martha could only gape at him. "Jake, you can't possibly. I mean, we barely know each other, and I come with so much trouble." "I know you're brave," Jake said, moving closer. "I know you're kind to animals and can cook better than anyone in 3 territories. I know you love that little girl more than your own life, and I know you've got more strength than most men I've met." He paused, his voice growing softer. "And I know that somewhere along the way I've come to care about you and Hope more than I ever thought possible." Martha felt tears threatening. But marriage, that's not something you enter into lightly. It's permanent, Jake. If we do this, you'd be bound to me legally, financially, in every way that matters. Good, Jake said simply. I want to be bound to you. Before Martha could respond, they heard the sound of horses approaching again. This time it was Sheriff Garrett, accompanied by two men Martha didn't recognize. Rough-looking types with the hard eyes of men accustomed to violence. Afternoon, Jake, Garrett said, though his tone was anything but friendly. Come to discuss your situation here. What situation is that, Sheriff? The situation where you're unlawfully harboring another man's wife and child. Garrett shifted. In his saddle, hand resting near his weapon. Mr. Hartley's filed a formal complaint, says you're refusing to return his property. His property is his business, Jake said evenly. These are people under my protection, not how the law sees it. One of the strangers spoke up, a thin man with cold eyes and a badge that identified him as a territorial marshal. Name's Briggs. I've got a court order here requiring you to surrender Martha Hartley and her child to their lawful husband and father. Jake's hands clenched at his sides, but his voice remained calm. And if I refuse, then we'll take them by force, Briggs said matter-of-factly. And you'll be arrested for interference with a lawful marriage. Martha stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady. What if I don't want to go? Marshal Briggs looked at her with the expression one might give a talking horse. Surprise. That the property had opinions at all. Ma'am, what you want doesn't enter into it. Law says wives obey their husbands. End of discussion. Actually, Jake said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket, there might be some discussion after all. He handed the document to Briggs, who read it with growing confusion. What's this supposed to be? Marriage license, Jake said. Filed this morning with Judge Crawford. Martha's no longer Martha Hartley. She's Martha Coleman now. The lie was so bold, so completely unexpected, that even Martha gasped. But she saw immediately what Jake was doing, buying them time, forcing Thomas to fight a legal battle rather than simply claiming his property. This is preposterous, Garrett sputtered. She can't marry someone else while she's already married. Actually, Doc Henderson said, appearing seemingly from nowhere with his characteristic perfect timing, she can if her first husband is legally dead. Which he was, according to the territorial records Thomas himself filed. Martha watched the three men exchange uncertain glances. The legal complexities were clearly beyond what they'd expected to deal with. I'll need to consult with higher authorities. Marshal Briggs said finally, until then nobody goes anywhere. After the men departed, Martha turned to Jake with a mixture of gratitude and terror. You do realize what you've just done. You've made yourself a target, legally and physically. Thomas won't let this stand. Jake reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the wooden rattle he'd been carving, its surface smooth and beautiful in the afternoon light. He held it out to Hope, who immediately grasped it with tiny fingers and brought it to her mouth to examine. Look at her, Jake said softly. Look how perfect she is. Look how much she trusts us to keep her safe. He met Martha's eyes. I'd rather die fighting for something that matters than live knowing I walked away when you needed me most. Martha looked down at her land deed lying on the table, the paper that represented everything Jake had worked for, everything he'd inherited from. His mother's family. He was willing to risk it all for them. The ranch, she whispered. If we fight this, you could lose everything. Martha, Jake said, his voice gentle but firm, you and Hope aren't just worth more than this land. You are everything. For 3 days, an uneasy quiet settled over the ranch, while lawyers in Denver and the territorial capital debated the legal complexities of Martha's status. Jake continued his daily work, but Martha noticed how he kept his rifle closer than usual and how his eyes constantly scanned the horizon for approaching riders. The tension was wearing on all of them. Even Hope seemed more fretful than usual, as if she could sense the adult's anxiety. It was while helping Jake repair a section of damaged fence that Martha made the discovery that would change everything. She'd offered to sort through Thomas's belongings, items he'd left behind during his hasty departure, looking for anything that might help their legal case. Most of it was unremarkable: business correspondence, receipts, personal effects that told the story of a man obsessed with appearances and social standing. But tucked inside an old tobacco pouch, she found something that made her blood run cold. A faded photograph showing Thomas with a woman and young boy she'd never seen before. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Thomas, Elizabeth and little Samuel, Denver, 1871. Martha stared at the photograph for a long moment, her mind racing. Thomas had never mentioned a previous family, never spoken of a first wife or son. Yet here was proof that before he'd married her, he'd had another life, another family he'd apparently abandoned without explanation. Her hands shaking, Martha searched more thoroughly through Thomas's possessions. Hidden in the false bottom of his document case, she found a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon. The return address made her stomach lurch. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartley, Denver, Colorado. With growing horror, Martha read letter after letter, from a woman pleading for Thomas to return, begging him to at least send money for their sick son's medical care, asking why he'd abandoned them without explanation. The letters spanned 2 years, growing increasingly desperate as Elizabeth described their poverty, little Samuel's declining health, and her own struggle to survive alone. The final letter, dated just months before Thomas had begun courting Martha, in Kansas, was brief and heartbreaking. "Thomas, Samuel died yesterday. The fever finally took him. I thought you should know you had a son, even if you chose not to acknowledge him in life. I'm leaving Denver. Don't try to find me if you ever develop a conscience. I never want to see you again." Elizabeth Martha sank into Jake's chair, the letters scattered around her like evidence of a crime. Thomas hadn't just abandoned her and hope, he'd done it before. There had been another wife, another child, another family destroyed by his callous selfishness. But there was more. At the bottom of the document case, she found legal papers that made her heart race with hope. Elizabeth Hartley had filed for divorce in Colorado Territorial Court, citing abandonment and willful desertion. The decree, dated 6 months before, Thomas's marriage to Martha was official and legal. Martha had never been Thomas's lawful wife at all. Their marriage was bigamous, invalid from the moment they'd spoken their vows. When Jake returned from town that evening, he found Martha sitting by the fire with the documents spread before her like a battle plan. Hope slept peacefully in her cradle, unaware that her mother had just discovered the key to their freedom. "Martha, what is it?" Without a word, she handed him the photograph and the divorce decree. She watched his face as he read, saw his expression change from confusion to understanding to righteous anger. He was already married, Jake said finally, married and divorced. Elizabeth Hartley filed for abandonment and desertion. The marriage was legally dissolved before Thomas ever met me. Martha's voice grew stronger as the full implications hit her. "That means I was never his legal wife. Hope isn't his legal child. He has no claim on either of us." Jake set down the papers and pulled Martha into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear. "You're free," he whispered against her hair. "You're actually free." But their celebration was short-lived. The sound of multiple horses approaching at speed sent Jake reaching for his rifle. Through the window, they could see torches again. But this time, there were more of them, and the riders weren't stopping to talk. Thomas burst through the door. Without knocking, his face flushed with rage and alcohol. Behind him came Marshal Briggs and 2 deputies, all armed and clearly prepared for trouble. "Enough games," Thomas snarled, his usual composed facade completely gone. "I'm taking what's mine, and I'm taking it now." "Actually," Martha said, rising from her chair with newfound confidence, "you're not taking anything. Because I have something you might find interesting." She held up the photograph and divorce decree. Thomas's face went white as he recognized them. "Where did you get those?" he demanded. "From your belongings. Amazing what people leave behind when they're in a hurry." Martha's voice was steady, strong. "Tell me, Thomas, what do you think a territorial judge will say when he learns you committed bigamy?" when he discovers you abandoned not one family, but two. Marshal Briggs stepped forward, his interest clearly piqued. What's she talking about, Hartley? Thomas's composure cracked completely. Those documents don't prove anything. They're forgeries, lies. The territorial court in Denver will have records, Jake interrupted. Easy enough to verify. It doesn't matter, Thomas shouted, desperation making his voice crack. She's still my wife. That child is still mine. No, Martha said quietly but with absolute certainty. I never was your wife, and Hope was never your child. Your marriage to Elizabeth makes our ceremony invalid. Bigamy, Thomas. That's a federal crime in the territories. The truth of it hit everyone in the room at the same moment. If Thomas had never been legally divorced when he married Martha, then their entire marriage was fraudulent. Martha had never been his property because she'd never been his legal wife. Marshal Briggs looked from Thomas to the documents to Martha, clearly recalculating the entire situation. Mr. Hartley, if these papers are genuine, they're lies, Thomas exploded. Forgeries designed to cheat me of what's rightfully mine. But even as he protested, everyone could see the guilt written across his face. The pattern was clear now. Thomas Hartley preyed on vulnerable women, married them for whatever benefits they could provide, then abandoned them when they became inconvenient. Only this time his past had caught up with him. I think, Marshal Briggs said slowly, we need to have a longer conversation about your legal status, Mr. Hartley. Starting with how many wives you've actually had. Thomas's face cycled through rage, fear, and calculation before settling on something Martha recognized, the cold, predatory look that meant he was preparing to do something desperate. If I can't have them legally, he said, his hand moving toward his gun, then maybe legal doesn't matter anymore. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to become an inferno. Martha instinctively moved toward Hope's cradle, while Jake shifted to put himself between Thomas and his family. Marshal Briggs and his deputies tensed, hands moving toward their weapons. But before anyone could draw, Doc Henderson's voice cut through the tension from the doorway. Might want to think twice about that, Thomas, the old physician said calmly. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood Sheriff Garrett, Judge Crawford, and half a dozen armed townsmen who'd clearly heard enough of the shouting to investigate. Thomas found himself surrounded, his support evaporated, his secrets exposed. The photograph that had revealed his pattern of abandonment lay on the table like an accusation, while the divorce decree proved his legal claims were worthless. Thomas Hartley, Judge Crawford said formally, you're under arrest for bigamy, fraud, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Marshal Briggs, if you would do the honors. As the handcuffs clicked around Thomas's wrists, he looked at Martha with pure hatred. This isn't over, he snarled. I'll find a way to make you pay for this. No, Martha said, meeting his gaze without flinching. It is over. You have no power over me anymore, Thomas. You never really did. After the lawmen led Thomas away, Martha sank into Jake's arms, finally allowing herself to believe it was true. The photograph that had exposed Thomas's lies lay forgotten on the floor, but its revelation had changed everything. She was free, truly, legally free for the first time in her adult life. What happens now? She asked Jake, as they watched the torches disappear into the night. Jake looked down at her, then at Hope sleeping peacefully, despite all the commotion. Now we decide what we want our future to look like. Together, if you'll have me. Martha thought about the recipe book that had brought them closer, the land deed Jake had been willing to sacrifice for her safety, the tiny wooden rattle that proved his love for Hope. She thought about all the ways this quiet, gentle man had shown her what real love looked like. Yes, she said simply, I'll have you. The week following Thomas's arrest brought an unexpected sense of normalcy to the ranch. Martha found herself moving through daily routines with a lightness she hadn't felt in years, cooking breakfast while Hope gurgled contentedly in her cradle, mending clothes while Jake worked outside, planning improvements to the cabin that would make it more suitable for a growing family. But beneath the peaceful surface, both she and Jake understood that their battle wasn't over. Thomas had been released on bail pending trial, and his threats still echoed in Martha's mind. Men like Thomas Hartley didn't accept defeat gracefully, especially when that defeat came at the hands of people they considered inferior. It was Judge Crawford who brought word of Thomas's latest machinations. The elderly jurist arrived on a cold morning in early November, his expression grave, despite the legal victory they'd recently won. "Thomas has hired lawyers from back east," the judge explained over coffee in Jake's cabin. "Expensive ones. They're claiming the Colorado divorce was invalid, that Elizabeth Hartley had no grounds for abandonment, since Thomas was conducting legitimate business in Kansas." Martha felt her stomach clench. Can they do that? Overturn a legal divorce? "They can try," Crawford said carefully. "Territorial law is complicated. Different territories sometimes don't recognize each other's legal proceedings. If they can prove the Colorado court lacked jurisdiction or that proper procedures weren't followed, then Martha's marriage to Thomas becomes valid again," Jake finished grimly. "Exactly. And if that happens, his claim to Martha and the child is legally sound." The implications hung heavy in the cabin air. Even with the photograph and Elizabeth's letters proving Thomas's pattern of abandonment, legal technicalities could still destroy everything they'd fought to build. "There is another option," Judge Crawford said slowly, "but it would require considerable courage from both of you." He reached into his coat and pulled out an official-looking document. A marriage license. Real this time, not the fabrication we used to buy time. If you two were to marry before the territorial review of the Colorado divorce, it would create a legal situation so complex that it might take years to untangle. Martha looked at the license, then at Jake. They'd discussed marriage in hypothetical terms, but seeing the actual papers made it suddenly, terrifyingly real. "Jake," she said quietly, "you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "Not because of legal complications or Thomas's threats. Because I love you, Martha. I love Hope. I want us to be a family, officially and forever." Martha felt tears threaten. "But if we do this now, under these circumstances, you'll always wonder. If I married you for protection rather than love." Jake stood and walked to his dresser, returning with a small tin box Martha had seen him handle carefully over the weeks. Inside, nestled in worn velvet, lay a simple gold band, his father's wedding ring, the one he'd kept hidden for 20 years. "Remember when I told you about my father leaving?" Jake said, turning the ring over in his weathered hands. "I kept this ring because it reminded me of what I never wanted to become. A man who runs when things get hard, who abandons the people." Counting on him, he looked directly into Martha's eyes. "Wearing this ring, making these vows with you. It's not about Thomas or legal complications. It's about choosing to be the kind of man who stays, who fights for what matters, who builds something lasting." Before Martha could respond, the sound of galloping horses interrupted them. Through the window, they could see Doc Henderson approaching. At dangerous speed, his horse lathered with sweat and his face etched with urgency. "Thank God you're both here," he gasped as he burst through the door. "Thomas broke jail last night. Killed a deputy doing it." The words hit like physical blows. Martha instinctively moved toward Hope's cradle while Jake reached for his rifle. "How?" Judge Crawford demanded. "Had help. 3 men, professionals by the look of it. Probably hired guns from Denver." Doc Henderson's breathing was labored from. "His hard ride. Sheriff Garrett's organizing a posse, but Thomas has a head start. Could be anywhere by now." Jake checked his weapon methodically, his face grim. "He'll come here. This ranch is unfinished business for him." "That's what we figured." Doc Henderson agreed. "Garrett sent me to warn you, maybe get you to town where there's more protection." "No," Martha said firmly, surprising everyone, including herself. "I won't run anymore. I won't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when Thomas will reappear to destroy whatever happiness I've found." "Martha, be reasonable," Judge Crawford urged. "The man's killed a lawman. He's got nothing left to lose." Exactly, Martha replied, which means this ends here one way or another. Jake set down his rifle and moved to stand beside her. She's right. We make our stand here together. Over the next several hours, the cabin transformed into a fortress. Jake boarded up windows, leaving only narrow slots for rifle barrels. Doc Henderson and Judge Crawford elected to stay and help defend the ranch, despite Martha's protests that they were risking their lives for people who weren't even their family. Actually, Judge Crawford said with a slight smile, I brought the marriage license for a reason. If you two are determined to face this together, you might as well do it as husband and wife. Martha looked at Jake, saw the question in his eyes. Around them, preparations for battle continued. Ammunition counted, escape routes planned, final defenses prepared. It should have been the worst possible time for a wedding. Yet somehow it felt exactly right. Will you marry me, Martha? Jake asked simply, not because of Thomas or the law or any other reason, except that I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. Martha took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses from years of hard work, the strength that had protected her, and hope, the gentleness that had shown her what real love looked like. Yes, she said, I'll marry you, Jake Coleman, because you gave me back my life, and I want to spend the rest of it showing you what that means to me. Judge Crawford performed the ceremony in Jake's modest cabin, with Doc Henderson serving as witness and hope, gurgling happily in her cradle, blissfully unaware of the danger surrounding them. When Jake slipped his father's ring onto Martha's finger, it fit as if it had been made for her. By the power vested in me by the territory, Judge Crawford intoned, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jake, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was gentle, sweet, and filled with promises of the future they would build together if they survived the night. As darkness fell, they took their positions. Jake stationed himself at the front window with his rifle, while Martha took the back with the pistol Doc Henderson had insisted she learn to use. Judge Crawford and Doc Henderson covered the sides, their own weapons ready. Hope slept peacefully in the center of the cabin, surrounded by adults who would die before letting harm come to her. Beside her cradle lay the wooden rattle Jake had carved, its surface smooth and beautiful, a symbol of the love and family they'd created together. You know, Martha said quietly as they waited in the darkness, I never thought I'd find happiness again after Thomas. Never thought any man would want a woman with another man's child. Hope's not another man's child, Jake replied firmly. She's our daughter now, mine as much as yours. Through the night air they heard it, the sound of multiple horses moving carefully through the trees, trying to approach without detection. Thomas had returned, and he hadn't come alone. Remember, Jake whispered, whatever happens, we're family. Now, we protect each other, and we protect Hope. Martha checked her pistol one final time, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Whatever happens, she agreed. The battle for their family was about to begin. The attack came just before dawn, when the darkness was deepest and most deceptive. Martha heard them first, the soft creak of leather, the muffled jingle of spurs, the whispered commands of men positioning themselves for assault. Thomas had brought professional killers, men who understood how to move silently through hostile territory. From her position at the back window, Martha could see shadows moving between the trees. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the pistol Doc Henderson had taught her to use, but her resolve remained steady. She thought of Hope, sleeping peacefully in the center of the cabin, surrounded by people who loved her, and found strength she hadn't known she possessed. Martha, Jake whispered from across the cabin, when this starts, you get down and stay down. Don't try to be a hero. Too late for that, she whispered back. We're all heroes tonight, or we're all dead. The first shot shattered the pre-dawn silence, splintering the wooden shutter beside Jake's head. He returned fire immediately, his rifle barking in the confined space of the cabin. More shots followed, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireworks. Martha found herself moving with surprising calm, drawing testimony papers from her coat pocket, the handwritten notes she'd prepared for Thomas's trial, detailing every cruelty, every abandonment, every moment of suffering he'd inflicted. These pages represented her voice, her refusal to remain silent about the abuse she'd endured. "Give it up, Coleman," Thomas's voice carried clearly across the yard. "Send out my wife and child, and maybe the rest of you live to see sunrise. Go to hell, Hartley." Jake shouted back, punctuating his response with another rifle shot. A bullet crashed through the back window, sending glass shards flying. Martha ducked instinctively, then forced herself back up to return fire. The pistol kicked harder than she'd expected, but she saw one of the shadows stumble and fall. Judge Crawford cried out from the side window. He'd been hit in the shoulder, though not seriously. Doc Henderson immediately moved to help him, applying pressure to the wound while trying to maintain his own defensive position. "How many are there?" Martha called out during a brief lull in the shooting. "At least 6, Jake replied grimly. "Maybe more." The odds were not in their favor, but Martha felt no despair. For the first time in her adult life, she was fighting for something that belonged to her. A family built on love rather than obligation. A home where she was valued rather than merely tolerated. Another volley of shots forced everyone to take cover. Hope woke and began crying, her wails adding urgency to an already desperate situation. Martha longed to comfort her daughter, but couldn't leave her position without exposing them all to greater danger. "Martha's testimony," Judge Crawford called out, gesturing toward the papers she'd dropped. "If something happens to us, those papers are the only record of what Thomas really is." Martha looked down at her testimony, pages of careful handwriting that detailed Thomas's pattern of abuse, his abandonment of multiple families, his willingness to use violence and legal manipulation to control women. These papers represented more than evidence. They were her refusal to be silenced, her determination to speak truth regardless of the consequences. "Thomas," she called out suddenly, an idea forming. "I know about Elizabeth. I know about your son Samuel, who died while you were off playing businessman in Kansas." The shooting stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, Martha could hear Thomas breathing heavily somewhere outside. "You don't know anything," he snarled, but she heard uncertainty in his voice. "I know you abandoned a sick child to die alone," Martha continued, her voice carrying clearly in the night air. "I know Elizabeth divorced you for desertion. I know our marriage was bigamous from the start." "Shut up," Thomas roared. "Shut your mouth or I'll shut it permanently." But Martha wasn't finished. Standing at the window, despite Jake's urgent gestures, to get down, she began reading from her testimony papers. Her voice rang out across the battlefield, clear and strong. "Thomas Hartley told me that bearing daughters was a woman's greatest shame. He said any woman who couldn't produce sons was worthless to her husband and society. When Hope was born, he looked at her for less than a minute before declaring her useless spawn and walking away. Each word seemed to hit Thomas like a physical blow. Martha could hear him moving restlessly outside, his composure cracking under the weight of his exposed cruelty. "When I was bleeding after a difficult birth, Thomas refused to summon help because he said I deserved to suffer for failing in my duty. When I begged him not to abandon us, he laughed and said watching me starve would teach other women what happened to those who disappointed their husbands." "Stop it!" Thomas's voice was raw with rage and something else, shame perhaps, or the fear that comes when a man's true nature is exposed to the light. But Martha continued reading, her testimony becoming both weapon and shield, her words carrying the power of truth into the darkness where evil men tried to hide their sins. Martha's public testimony had the effect of a match thrown into gunpowder. Thomas's hired men began to shift restlessly, clearly uncomfortable with the details of their employer's character being broadcast for all to hear. Professional killers they might be, but even they had limits when it came to the abuse of women and children. "That's enough!" Thomas screamed, his voice cracking with rage. "Kill them all! I don't care about the woman anymore. Just kill them!" But his order revealed the depths of his desperation, and Martha sensed an opportunity. She continued reading from her testimony, her voice never wavering despite the bullets that splintered the wood around her. Thomas Hartley told me that women were property to be used and discarded when they became inconvenient. He said any man who showed kindness to an abandoned woman was a fool, because women like me were trash that deserved whatever happened to them. One of the hired guns called out from the darkness, "Hartley, you didn't tell us this was about beating up women and babies." "Shut up and do your job," Thomas snarled back. Jake saw the opportunity Martha had created. "You men out there," he called, "take a good look at who you're working for. A man who abandons sick children, who beats pregnant women, who would kill a baby to satisfy his own pride." The gunfire became sporadic, uncertain. Martha could hear heated whispers from different positions around the cabin as Thomas's hired. Men began questioning their employer's character and their own involvement in his vendetta, but Thomas himself seemed to lose all rational thought. Through the pre-dawn gloom, Martha could see him moving toward the cabin, no longer hiding, his face twisted with murderous rage. He'd clearly decided that if he couldn't have his property, he would destroy it rather than let Jake keep it. "Thomas is coming," Jake warned, adjusting his grip on his rifle. "This is it." Martha tucked her testimony papers safely into her coat and picked up Hope's blanket, the quilt she'd sewn during her recovery, every stitch representing the new family bonds they'd created together. She wrapped it protectively around the baby, who had finally fallen back asleep, despite the chaos around her. The blanket symbolized everything worth fighting for. The love that had grown between her and Jake, the maternal bond that had made her stronger than she'd ever imagined possible, the home they'd built from nothing but determination and mutual respect. Thomas kicked in the front door just as Jake rose to meet him. The two men faced each other across the small cabin, one driven by possessiveness and wounded pride, the other by love and protective instincts. "She was mine first," Thomas panted, his gun trained on Jake. "The child was mine first. You had no right to take them." "I didn't take anything," Jake replied calmly, his own weapon steady. "You threw them away. I just had the sense to recognize their value." "Their value," Thomas laughed bitterly. "A barren woman and a useless girl child. What value could they possibly have?" Behind Thomas, Martha could see his hired men backing away from the cabin. Whatever loyalty money had bought was evaporating as they witnessed their employer's complete break from sanity. "More value than you'll ever understand," Jake said, "because love isn't something you own or control, Thomas. It's something you earn, something you protect, something you cherish." Thomas's face contorted with rage. Pretty words from a dirt-poor cowboy who couldn't afford a real wife of his own. "You're right," Jake said simply. "I couldn't afford a wife like Martha. No man could. She's too good for any of us. But somehow she chose to love me anyway, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of that choice." The sincerity in Jake's voice seemed to enrage Thomas further. He raised his pistol with shaking hands, but Martha moved faster than thought itself. Still holding Hope's blanket, she stepped between the two men. "No," she said firmly. "This ends now, Thomas. Your threats, your violence, your claim on our lives, it all ends here." "Get out of the way, Martha," Thomas snarled. "This is between me and him." "No, it's between you and me. It always has been." Martha's voice carried the authority of a woman who had finally found her strength. "You want to shoot someone? Shoot me. But you'll have to look me in the eyes when you do it. You'll have to face what you're really destroying." For a moment, Thomas wavered, his gun hand trembling. In the growing daylight, Martha could see the conflict in his face, rage warring with the last shreds of whatever humanity he might once have possessed. Then she heard it, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. Sheriff Garrett and his posse had finally arrived, surrounding the cabin and cutting off any escape Thomas might have planned. "It's over, Thomas," Martha said quietly. "Put down the gun." Thomas looked around wildly, seeing his hired men surrendering. To the posse, hearing Garrett's authoritative voice demanding his surrender. His grand plan for revenge had crumbled, leaving him trapped and desperate, but cornered men are often the most dangerous. And Martha realized too late that Thomas had decided if he couldn't win, he would at least take her with him into destruction. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of Cedar Ridge's small church, illuminating the faces of townspeople gathered to witness something unprecedented. A wedding ceremony where the bride was choosing to marry for love rather than necessity, security, or social expectation. Martha stood before the altar in her carefully repaired wedding dress, the same ivory silk that had once symbolized her naive hopes, now transformed into something beautiful through patient restoration. Each stain had been carefully removed, each tear lovingly mended, until the dress represented not past mistakes, but the possibility of redemption and second chances. The events of that terrible dawn in November had ended with Thomas's final defeat, though not in the way anyone might have expected. Faced with Martha's unwavering courage and the arrival of Sheriff Garrett's posse, Thomas had made one last desperate attempt to destroy what he could not possess. But when he'd raised his gun toward Hope's cradle, Jake had moved with the swift certainty of a man protecting his family. The confrontation had ended swiftly. Thomas was taken alive, though wounded, and was now serving a lengthy sentence in the territorial prison for murder, attempted murder, bigamy, and a host of other charges. His hired gunmen had testified against him in exchange for reduced sentences, their testimony confirming every detail of Martha's account of his cruelty and violence. More importantly, the legal challenge to Elizabeth Hartley's divorce had collapsed once Thomas's criminal activities came to light. Martha's freedom was absolute and unquestioned. She was legally, definitively, no longer bound to the man who had caused her so much suffering. Now, as she stood beside Jake before Judge Crawford, Martha felt the profound peace that comes from choosing one's own destiny. This wedding was nothing like her first. No coercion, no desperate hope for security, no naive belief that marriage would somehow complete her as a person. This time, she came to the altar as a whole person, choosing to share her life with another whole person. Jake wore his father's wedding ring on a chain around his neck. He would give it to Martha during the ceremony, but first he wanted to honor the man who had abandoned him by transforming that symbol of desertion into something beautiful and lasting. In his coat pocket lay 2 simple gold bands he'd commissioned from the town's blacksmith, crafted from gold he'd earned through honest work, and purchased with money saved through careful planning. Hope, now 8 months old and beginning to crawl, was held by Sarah Mills in the front pew. The baby had grown into a healthy, happy child, with Martha's dark hair and Jake's gentle brown eyes. She gurgled contentedly during the ceremony, occasionally reaching toward her parents with chubby hands that grasped at sunbeams filtering through. The stained glass windows, Doc Henderson served as Jake's best man, while Sarah Mills stood as Martha's matron of honor. The entire congregation represented a community that had learned important lessons about judgment, compassion, and the true meaning of Christian charity. "Dearly beloved," Judge Crawford began, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had witnessed both the worst and best of human nature. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of 2 people who have shown us all what it means to fight. For love, to protect the vulnerable, and to build something beautiful from the ashes of despair." When it came time for vows, Martha spoke first, her voice clear and strong as it carried throughout the church. "Jake Coleman, you saved my life in every way a person can be saved. You showed me that I was worth protecting, worth cherishing, worth loving just as I am. You gave me back my voice when the world tried to silence me, and you gave Hope a father who will love her, not despite being a daughter, but because she is ours together. I promise to love you, support you, and stand beside you through whatever challenges life may bring." Jake's vows were simpler, but no less heartfelt. "Martha, you and Hope taught me what family really means. Not blood or obligation, but choice. and love and the decision to fight for each other every single day. I promise to protect you both, to cherish you both, and to spend the rest of my life proving worthy of the love you've given me." When Judge Crawford pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was witnessed by a community that had learned to celebrate love in all its forms. The simple gold bands they exchanged were blessed not by wealth or status, but by the knowledge that they had been earned through sacrifice, dedication, and the willingness to risk everything for those they loved. The reception that followed was held in Sarah Mills's general store, with the entire town contributing food, music, and heartfelt congratulations. Even some of the men who had initially supported Thomas's claims came forward to apologize, having learned through recent events that legal rights and moral rights were not always the same thing. As evening approached and the celebration wound down, Jake and Martha returned to their ranch, now legally and officially their home together. The cabin had been expanded over the winter months, with help from neighbors who had come to respect their courage and determination. There was now a proper bedroom for Hope, a larger kitchen where Martha could continue exploring the recipes in, Jake's mother's cookbook, and a front porch where they could sit together in the evenings and watch their daughter play. The blood-stained shawl that had first wrapped Hope was now carefully preserved in a cedar chest, along with Thomas's abandonment letter, the photograph that had exposed his crimes, and Martha's testimony papers. These artifacts would serve as reminders of how far they had come, testaments to survival and the triumph of love over cruelty. But it was the newer artifacts that truly told their story. Jake's mother's recipe book, now filled with Martha's own additions and notes. The wooden rattle Jake had carved, showing signs of loving use. The land deed that no longer represented what Jake was willing to lose, but what he had gained. And most precious of all, the marriage certificate that made their family official. In the eyes of law and community alike, as they sat on their porch that evening, Hope playing at their feet with her beloved rattle, Martha reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had been a woman with no legal existence, no rights, no future beyond mere survival. Now she was a wife, a mother, a partner in a thriving ranch, and a respected member of a community that had learned to value character over convention. The setting sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, and in the distance they could see other homesteads where families were settling in for the evening. Their story had become part of the larger story of the frontier, the ongoing tale of people choosing to build something new and beautiful in a place where courage and determination mattered more than the circumstances of one's birth. Hope looked up at them both and smiled, her tiny hand closing around Martha's finger with the same fierce grip she'd shown on the day of her birth. In that moment, Martha understood that some stories don't end. They simply transform into new beginnings, new chances and new reasons to believe in the possibility of love conquering all.